Rule of Rose is a PlayStation 2 survival horror game developed by Punchline and published by Sony in Japan, Atlas in North America, and 505 Games in Europe. Despite its relative low profile compared to other big names in the genre, Rule of Rose has somewhat of an infamous reputation for a number of different reasons. The high price point and the scarcity of used copies, the controversy surrounding its alleged subject matter, and subsequent bans throughout Europe and the UK, not to mention the incredibly divisive reception from the few who actually played it. Rule of Rose really is the kind of game that you're either really going to like or absolutely despise. I'm personally in the former camp on this game, as Rule of Rose is both something that I have a lot of respect for and an experience I genuinely enjoy. Today I'm basically just going to be laying out exactly why I enjoy Rule of Rose as much as I do, and attempt to mount a defense of a game with some truly glaring drawbacks. Look, I'm not blind to it. Rule of Rose is an extremely flawed game at its best moments and downright busted on a fundamental level at its worst. In the interest of intellectual honesty, we'll start off this look at the game by laying out all of its most egregious errors. As pretty much anyone who has played the game will tell you, the number one issue with Rule of Rose is the awful, slapped together at the last second combat system. Now, I get it. Combat in survival horror games is supposed to be a bit awkward and unwieldy. The whole point of these games is to create a sense of powerlessness against the foes you're up against, and giving players lackluster offensive capabilities is a decent way of doing it. I'd rather have the clunky combat seen in the original Silent Hill games over the complete absence of it from crap like Slender or Layers of Fear, just for examples. However, I think we can all agree that Rule of Rose takes that concept way too far. Just for starters, it's lacking a lock-on mechanic in a game that's made up primarily of fixed camera angles, and considering that melee weapons may as well be the only weapons available to the player, trying to successfully land a hit on some of the enemies can be a pain with the perspective. The attack animations, while expressive and well done, are also odd. Stabbing enemies is fine, but for the swinging weapons like the pipe or the shovel, the exact moment that a swing connects isn't well telegraphed to the player. On top of that, trying to do a full combo with any weapon tends to leave the player vulnerable with an unnecessarily long cooldown animation. That, with the bizarre swing hitboxes, can make for one hell of a frustrating experience on its own, but the combat in Rule of Rose only gets worse from there. If the combat was this busted but the game made fighting entirely optional, then fine. It would still be an issue, but it wouldn't have been game-breaking. No, the real issue is that Rule of Rose habitually forces players into combat sections, especially towards the game's end. There are ways to mitigate frustration and cheese the game, granted, but this isn't a defense for the choice made by Punchline to put combat on center stage in the last third. It even has a combat gauntlet section. No survival horror game should have something like that. Then there are the boss fights, by far the most common issue that players have with the game. There are only 3 throughout the entire game, and to be fair, it's actually fairly easy to cheese out the last 2, but my god, that first one is awful. Hoffman, this bondage freak show right here, is easily one of the worst boss fights I have ever fought in a video game. He deals insane damage from regular swings, which are fast and extremely hard to dodge due to the laughably large hitbox on his attack, yet practically no damage at all is dealt from his slow command grabs, which are actually very easy to avoid. A part of me thinks that someone mixed up the damage value of these 2 attacks, since those are all he actually has. Even if the swing didn't do obscene damage to the player, the exaggerated knockback from the hit would still ruin this fight entirely. When struck, Jennifer will do this Castlevania-esque knockback animation and will slowly get back up over about 5 seconds. God help you if Hoffman starts rapid-fire swings over Jennifer as she starts standing up. You may as well reset the game and reload your save at that point. And there is no reliable method of beating Hoffman without taking damage. Lord knows I've tried and retried to learn one. You just have to grin and bear it, hoping that you'll get lucky and he won't do his berserker barrage on you. Even outside of the combat, the gameplay of Rule of Rose suffers. What count as puzzles are lazy, in-name only affairs that all boil down to getting Brown to search for an item, finding the item, and then finding out where to use said item. Rinse and repeat. There isn't anything more to the gameplay beyond these 2 aspects either. You just run back and forth throughout the level looking for key items to progress the plot and get into awful fights with broken combat along the way. The progression and presentation are also poor to boot. The chapter-based structure of the game leads to tedium of doing these same 2 actions over and over again in the exact same level for most of the game's runtime, which is further hampered by the obtuse progression of certain chapters. The first chapter on the airship has some bizarre triggers for progressing the events, boiling down to just running back and forth down the same hallway numerous times. And the last chapter, called The Funeral, never actually explains to the player that, in order to progress, you need to find and interact with every kid in the house. There's no getting around it. Rule of Rose is poorly designed. I won't make the claim that it was intentional, that being chock full of terrible game design and not being remotely fun somehow makes it a genuine horror game or anything condescending like that. The pure gameplay of Rule of Rose is downright bad, plain and simple. With the lion's share of the issues out in the open, we'll touch on two smaller ones outside of the gameplay. While later on we're going to go over how the story is one of the game's strong suits, there's one area that it's a bit redundant in. The game will constantly need to remind you about how Jennifer is a weak, submissive victim. It just loves establishing and re-establishing this for the player, and there's only so many times that you can see Jennifer getting abused before you just scream, "Get on with it." Also, the sound design has some low points, as in-game voice samples and Brown's bark can be bizarrely low quality, and this broom smacking sound right here, this is laughably bad, and removes all tension the scene could have had. Having said all of that, completely tearing into the thing, here's all the reasons that I genuinely enjoy Rule of Rose. Aesthetically, Rule of Rose is an absolute stunner, keeping in mind that a smaller team of about 25 people worked with a less than stellar budget to make it. The character models are all detailed and extremely expressive, and the in-game animation work is very well done. Ignoring how janky the combat is, Jennifer's attack animations are all nice and are a much more interesting way of expressing her discomfort with violence and direct confrontation than simple exposition. Little touches like how she'll look away while swinging sometimes are appreciated, and Rule of Rose is full of this kind of attention to detail. The pre-rendered CG cutscenes, done by Shirogumi, are all stunning for their time. The framing of each scene is well done, someone had a decent eye for cinematography, and some of these visual effects are downright excellent. Just check out that water, it looks nice even today. The art style is also a big plus. All of the characters have some pretty damn good designs, each being memorable, distinct from one another, yet not looking unbelievable. They all look like how people at the time could have dressed. Enemies have an uncanny look to them, and their designs get more interesting as the game progresses. I could have done with some more variety, as you don't see some of the wilder designs like this long neck thing very often, but as is, the monster roster is pretty neat. The bosses, for as much grief as they cause players to fight, are all great designs. Each one is disturbing in their own way, with Hoffman and Stray Dog in particular being highlights to me. While the mermaid I feel goes a touch overboard in its design to look unsettling, the simple mundane absurdities of these two make for some truly memorable monsters. And without talking too much about the story just yet, the game is loaded with small visual motifs, symbols, and minor details which help paint a much richer narrative, being both striking and plot relevant. And the storybook presentation of it all is well handled, with the flipbook style animations for chapter introductions, impossible setting, grim-esque narration, and even user interface all coming together to form a phenomenal style that no other game has ever tried to replicate, at least that I'm aware of. The audio work is fairly good too, but across the board it's more hit and miss compared to the stellar visual direction. The voiceover work is serviceable, but few truly stand out in their roles. One scene with Jennifer towards the end was quite nice, and I found Stray Dog's voice work to be pretty eerie, but overall it's nothing to write home about. The sound design has its peaks and valleys, with the reverse speech the imps say being a high point and that broom scene being a definite low. The real star of the show, however, is the soundtrack. It was composed by Yukata Minobe of Skies of Arcadia fame, and was recorded with real instruments rather than digital ones, giving the sound a real crisp quality other games with faux orchestras lack. I really enjoy the music in this game. The heavy use of strings gives Rule of Rose a kind of sound that you don't hear in other horror games, let alone video games generally, and the tracks used are appropriate for the situations they're used in. The music can range from panicked plucks of violins to more somber piano pieces. And I have to admit, the game's main theme, I Love Suicide, is something that I've genuinely come to love. It has this perfect mix of being somewhat unsettling yet still pleasant and easy on the ears. The singer has an incredibly unique voice, and the lyrics are both haunting and applicable to the game's story. It's been stuck in my head since I started working on this script, and I have no complaints about that. Atlus themselves seem to agree that this game had one hell of a soundtrack, because they published the full OST as a separate CD, something that Silent Hill 3 did as well. So now here's the hard part. We're going to try and find merit in the aspect of Rule of Rose that is almost universally panned, something I even spent the first chunk of this video berating, the gameplay part of this video game. Again, just to reiterate, it's bad. If you hate Rule of Rose simply for how busted it is as a video game, I will not blame you for it. For a game that very clearly is about the experience, essentially everything that isn't the game part, I'd argue that Rule of Rose is more generous than you would believe, allowing you to fairly easily cheese its garbage. For starters, the game is very liberal with hit stun. Sure, while enemies can interrupt your animations and stun lock you in place, you can do the exact same thing to them. Even the knockdown attacks from Hoffman and the Big Children, probably the most dangerous foes in the entire game, can be interrupted with attacks of your own. The trick is to not just mash the attack button, as the 3-hit combo that comes out of that, while doing more damage overall, leaves you wide open for a counter. Instead, what I recommend doing is doing a slight pause in between hitting the attack button, about a quarter of a second long. That way, instead of doing the combo, Jennifer will quickly spam the first swing of an attack string. Since most, if not all attacks do stun damage, belting out this one fast move repeatedly can trap enemies within your rhythm, meaning they can't get out and do the same to you. Well, except Hoffman, he can still get out. Don't get me wrong either, this is still a fundamental flaw of the entire game, since it doesn't actually fix the core issues of the combat system, which the game forces you to engage in. What it does do is let you cheese out the game to mitigate the potential frustration from the blatantly bad design. And another thing, a survival horror game centered around storytelling shouldn't have to have the player focus on crap like hit stun and iframe advantages, since that takes the player right out of whatever atmosphere the game is trying to build. The cut difficulty select would have gone a long way to fix this, I think, since being able to put the game on easy would be the best option for those just here for the story. However, for all my bitching, there is one aspect of Rule of Rose's gameplay that is actually decently designed. At least compared to everything else, that is. In contrast to how Huey was handled with the bizarre training friendship mechanics found in the strikingly similar Haunting Ground, Brown, the dog partner in Rule of Rose, is always a benefit to have around. Brown can search for items, which while an annoyance for the redundant pseudo-puzzles that it leads to is extremely helpful for finding healing items lying around the map. Finding these can let you more easily brute force your way through the game if you're struggling. In combat, Brown can help out in a number of different ways. He can distract regular enemies so you can get free hits in, tell you exactly where the mermaid boss will draw from, and can actually damage Hoffman during that fight. Brown has no hitbox for Jennifer to get caught on, and acts as a hitbox for enemies to get caught on. No matter where in a room Brown is in relation to Jennifer, he will always automatically exit alongside her. Considering just how much of the gameplay Punchline completely botched, the fact that Brown works reasonably well is a shocker. He's always helpful, never an issue to have around, and it's just one cute little doggo. Brown is a pretty good partner and a very good boy. This is the real make or break for people. Rule of Rose is an odd game in pretty much all aspects, and the story is likewise pretty out there. The story is told primarily through symbols, small hidden details within the environments, metaphor, and a good chunk of it is left open to individual interpretation. The game has been compared to the Silent Hill series by many people, and while the original trilogy are head and shoulders above Rule of Rose in quality, hell, even 4 had less overt gameplay issues, it's still a valid comparison. Rule of Rose is one of the few games that I'd put in a similar category to the Team Silent games. Survival horror games with stories and themes dealing primarily with real-life topics and aspects of the human condition. If those kind of games interest you, and you're fine with trying to get around some truly awful game design, then I'd highly recommend either skipping to this section of the video, or just not watching it anymore. I won't be giving any spoilers or doing some long-winded plot analysis, only briefly going over the ideas very broadly, but it's best to experience it for yourself blind if it sounds appealing to you. If you still need a bit more of a hook or just want to hear what I have to say on it, for whatever reason, we'll continue. Rule of Rose has a lot of themes and ideas for pretentious goobers like me to latch onto. Abuse within the foster care system, nature versus nurture, cycles of abuse and learned behavior, the duality inside people, trauma and its effects, repression, a lot of stuff under the hood. But hey, don't take my word with it, let's hear from Punchline themselves. Gamasutra interviewed the game's director Shuji Ishikawa and the Sony assistant producer Yuya Takayama in 2006 and were probed about the implied sexuality within the game. Takayama replied, "We wanted to depict the darker side of children. Not really dark per se, But if you really think about kids, they aren't really afraid of the same things that adults are, and often aren't aware of the consequences. Something that may seem benign to them may seem wrong or frightening to adults, but it's really just a form of innocence. He expanded on that by saying that the theme is supposed to be one of intimate familiarity. However, the most prominent theme, again only touching on the broad strokes, is an unhealthy idea of love, or attachment as the Atlas USA producer Carl Chen puts it, leading into obsession. More specifically, the damage that kind of dangerous infatuation can do. We see this in numerous areas in Rule of Rose, and many members of the cast are defined by this kind of attachment. Be it a need to be loved and approved of by anyone and everyone, the fixation on the loss of one you loved, or a more reprehensible, predatory kind. Much of the story of Rule of Rose is centered around exploring the causes of this kind of attachment in a person, and it goes out of its way to portray these characters in a fleshed out, complicated manner. Going back to the presentation briefly, the storybook and grim fairy tale style is extremely distinctive. And that, paired with the dreamlike atmosphere of the events, lead to Rule of Rose having a very striking atmosphere that few other games are similar to, and no other truly emulates. It's bold, one of a kind, and it will leave you with a fair bit to think about. Few other games have the guts to try to tackle the subject matter that Rule of Rose does, while still keeping it relatively tasteful to avoid being exploitative about it. If any of this has sold you, I do recommend stopping the video and giving Rule of Rose a shot for yourself. Assuming that you can emulate it or buy a reprint, and not shell out at least $250 for a used copy in questionable condition. Rule of Rose is infamous for its scarce nature and high price on the secondhand market. And beyond the general gameplay mess, the price point is the biggest hurdle in recommending it to people. Why exactly does Rule of Rose cost so much? What caused a low-budget niche game to blow up in price like this? It's a bit of an odd story, so before getting there, let's touch on how Rule of Rose was put together in the first place. Rule of Rose was developed by Punchline, a studio founded by Yoshiro Kimura. Kimura worked at a studio called Love Delict beforehand, who specialized in similarly odd games to what Punchline would make, such as Moon, Remix RPG Adventure, UFO, A Day in the Life, and LOL, Lack of Love. Punchline's first game was the PS2 adventure game Tulip, about some guy who goes around the town he lives in trying to cheer up people at the lowest points in their lives by kissing them. Yup, it's a strange one. Punchline was actually approached by Sony to develop a survival horror game for the PlayStation 2. Rather than following popular trends in the genre at the time, Punchline wanted to put out something less conventional. Rule of Rose's director Shuji Ishikawa expanded on this further, so we got a request from Sony to make a horror game, but that was all they said. It was a bit vague. We had a number of discussions with the Sony staff about what makes a horror game, and we at Punchline didn't want to make a game that was just like Biohazard, and all of those. We wanted to create a different kind of fear, a very quiet horror, something that's quite far from surprise and shock-based horror. More of a psychological thriller. That wound up taking the shape of a game surrounding childhood and children. It's the fear that comes out of children being genuine and without boundaries. The original pitch for the story was about a child who was kidnapped by a man, probably stray dog from the final release, trying to escape his house while interacting with the ghosts of his previous child victims. This pitch was rejected, probably for being fairly tasteless, but remnants of it can be seen in a chapter in Rule of Rose's final release. The focus was then shifted to a fear between girls, and led to the choice to focus on the dichotomy between children and adults' views of each other. We sort of wanted to show you not only how scary adults can be from a child's perspective, because that's been touched on many times, but also how scary children can be from an adult's perspective. We wanted to see that contrast. Brown actually originally wasn't supposed to be included, and Carl Chen expanded on this when pressed. Actually, Brown wasn't involved in the game at all in the original planning stages. It was only after the game started taking shape that the creators realized that the game wasn't interesting enough with Jennifer alone. Brown added another element to the gameplay, but he also helped counterbalance the helpless and gloomy personality of Jennifer. People who've played through the entire game will also understand the importance of having him in the storyline. He's not the main character, but he's definitely the central character, and much of the game's twisted plot is set in motion because of him. And in the same interview, Chen explains why the combat was implemented the way it was in the final release. Oh, there's room for improvement. In fact, I believe one of the producers said he would have liked to polish the combat system a bit more, but budget and time constraints prevented them from doing that. If anything, I would have liked the collision and hit detection to be more fine-tuned. I do believe it's realistic to have Jennifer be a bit frail and weak, so in terms of player strength and game balance, I think the game has it right on the money. The developers researched the behavior of actual Western children, asking them to draw out what made them happy and scared, to more accurately depict the game's cast. And when asked about fearing any sort of backlash for Rule of Rose, specifically from parents, Yuya Takayama replied by saying, "First of all, we're not worried in the least. If you play the game to completion, even if parents do, I'm sure they'll see that this game has value, and is very much from the heart. The main theme is really about trust and fealty." This quote in particular is interesting in hindsight, if only they knew why. So why exactly is Rule of Rose so expensive? Well, the limited run with 3 different publishers handling it in 3 different regions doesn't help, but the driving issue was the controversy surrounding the game's release, and the stick up the ass of one European commissioner. Franco Frattini had a lengthy political career in Italy before any of the Rule of Rose nonsense happened, acting as state attorney and magistrate in Piedmont, Italy in 1984. However, decades later, while acting as the European Commission's Justice and Security Minister, he decided to wage a new war, calling for an outright ban of Rule of Rose based on the game's content. Now, what I'm about to read to you is a section from Article 17 of the French National Assembly's presentation on the matter. A link to what I'm reading from will be in the description below, because this nonsense has to be seen to be believed, and anyone who thinks it's only the United States who's prone to false moral outrage over media they find distasteful should give it a read. Might amend that worldview for you. The requirement for signage alerting the violent nature of certain games, as mentioned in Articles 32 and 33, constitutes an important barrier to the broadcasting of certain particularly violent video games. However, in cases of extreme violence, this cannot be enough to protect minors. It therefore seems necessary to prohibit purely and simply certain games for sale and rental. Violence and perversion have reached their peak with a game called Rule of Rose, which comes to the European market. It is the European Commission, through its Vice President Franco Frattini, who is sounding the alarm about violent video games that represent a real danger to our children. A debate bringing together the Ministers of the Interior of the European Union is due to take place in December on this particular theme. Mr. Frattini is in favor of a total ban on these games for children under 18 years old. We randomly shoot passers-by, we massacre children in schools, we crush pedestrians, we rape, torture, massacre. That's what our children play on their computers. The game Rule of Rose is located in an English boarding school in the 1930s. The goal of the game embodies an unacceptable sadism and perversion. It is to violate in the most horrible conditions a girl and then torture her before killing her in the worst of sufferings. Whoever has shown the most infamous and disgusting ignominy wins the game. The publisher Sony has shown responsibility in renouncing the exploitation of the game Rule of Rose. Unfortunately, another publisher, much less scrupulous, took over the game on its own and is currently marketing it in Europe. France is directly exposed. Extremely violent video games are more and more numerous. So much so that we can say they have become commonplace. Each of us must take responsibility. Let's just ask ourselves, how does a child or teenager completely immersed for hours a day in a virtual world of gratuitous violence, murder, torture come out of the game? Is he still able to distinguish the real world from the virtual, the tolerable from the unacceptable? Our society cannot condone such calls for violence, whose sole purpose for designers, publishers, and distributors is in fact only lucrative. Our responsibility as elected officials should lead us to vote for the total ban on the marketing, sale, or rental of ultraviolent games throughout our territory at the risk of criminal and financial penalties. Of course, and at the same time, we must continue the work of signaling young adults and raising parents' awareness to the dangers of these games. Video games have become a social phenomenon. Do not make it an uncontrollable factor of violent decadence in our society. I find it a little ironic that this is from the French National Assembly, considering that the French extremism movement in their filmmaking scene was still fresh in 2006. Just compared to even something relatively famous like Martyrs, Rule of Rose is downright tame. And not to disparage one of my favorite movies, but the French language film Irreversible from 2002 has a scene like this to start with. The European Union and United Kingdom publisher 505 Games rightly called out Frattini on this nonsense, their official statement reading, "Rule of Rose is a horror genre of video game, similar to a number of other video games and movies on the market today, but does not in any way incite minors to commit violent acts and does not promote acts of violence towards minors." In the end, however, they had to cave, while in the same press release stating, "We're not worried about our integrity being called into question because Mr. Frattini's quotes are nonsense," 505 pulled the plug on Rule of Rose's sales in the UK. And that, along with the multiple publishers and limited print runs stated earlier, is why Rule of Rose is such a valuable game these days. Thankfully, we live in an era where it's much easier to access the game and try it out for yourself through emulation. Though not if assholes like Nintendo get their way. Needless to say, Rule of Rose isn't going to be for everyone, as we went over at the start. However, for that small niche who will get a kick out of this, Rule of Rose will be an unforgettable experience. Simply put, there's no other game on the market that will be exactly like it. You can certainly draw parallels between it and Silent Hill or Haunting Ground, the latter most directly, and personally I saw some parallels with Silent Hill 3 and 4. However, they're loose connections, and Rule of Rose is a style, presentation, and narrative unlike anything else. It tackles subject matter few other games do, and provides an ample number of things to read into. Well, assuming that it's something you care about or something that speaks to you. And the number one thing that I respect about Rule of Rose is that, for lack of a more elegant way to put it, it's ballsy. Punchline made exactly the kind of game they wanted to make, telling exactly the story they wanted to tell, and didn't back down from any sort of pressure. Hell, they could have gotten the game published worldwide by Sony had they toned the game down. When asked about why Sony didn't pick the game up in the US, Yuya Takayama answered, "Wow, that's a rough question. How shall I say this? Well, when Sony looked at the game, they felt it wasn't really in sync with their corporate image. Their personal pride wanted it to be a bit tamer if it were to have the Sony name in the US. If Punchline relaxed the game's content, even being as relatively tame as it is already, Sony would have given the game its full international backing and the controversy from the European Commission might not have happened, but Punchline said no. Rule of Rose, for all of its faults, has strong vision and some genuine passion behind it, and Punchline stood beside it no matter what. And if making what you want to make, telling censor-happy suits to get fucked, and getting banned in the UK isn't punk rock as shit, I don't know what is. That kind of originality and care in an incredibly flawed package is something that I'd take over some purely average yet passionless cash grab any day of the week. At the end of this all, finally wrapping up this damn video, I'll conclude by saying that I honestly can't recommend Rule of Rose. For everything that I like, even love about it, the egregious gameplay blunders hold it back to being anything worth playing for even survival horror aficionados. But, as I said, there is a small niche audience who I guarantee you will find something here to love, shown by the cult following that Rule of Rose has already gathered over the past decade. I'd put it in the same camp as something like D2, Drakengard, and a lot of early Suda51 games. It won't be everyone's thing, hell, it won't be for most, but it's a truly original game that provides a unique experience. I have nothing but respect for Rule of Rose, and after playing and replaying it for this video, I've come to actually kind of enjoy it. It's not as good as many other survival horror games that tell a compelling narrative open to interpretation, both released before and after it, but I do not regret the time I spent with it in any way.